Hello and welcome to Instant Insights. My name is Eve Thomas and today I will be talking to Tim Gould, Chief Energy Economist at the International Energy Agency. Tim provides strategic advice across IEA activities and analysis and is the head of the Division for Energy Supply and Investment Outlooks. Hi Tim, how are you?
Hi, very good, thanks. Pleasure to join you.
We're delighted to have you joining us on our podcast today. I'd like to dive straight in and ask you about your thoughts around the COP28 pledges and the IEA's analysis of them. Could you tell us what the key pledges are and whether you think they are sufficient to limit global warming to within the 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold?
So in advance of the COP28 meeting, we set out 5 points that we felt were really important to get the energy sector on track for an ambitious climate outcome. So one that's aligned with that 1.5 degree goal. And what we highlighted as really important elements of the energy discussion were the tripling of renewable capacity by the end of this decade, the doubling of the rate of improvement in energy efficiency. We talked about the need to bring down non-CO2 gases, so particularly a focus on methane emissions. We highlighted the need also to talk about fossil fuels and that we're not going to get a reduction in emissions unless we also get a reduction in fossil fuel use. And finally, we were very keen to make sure that investment flows to emerging and developing economies were part of the conversation and how to scale that up and what the international community can do in that regard. And from those 5 points, you can see how many of them featured quite strongly in the outcome. So the tripling of renewables is there. The doubling of efficiency improvement is there. There was some movement on the issue of methane. There's the language on fossil fuels, of course, the recognition of the need to transition away from fossil fuels in a just, orderly and equitable way, with a particular focus on action this decade. I think where we have a little bit more hesitation is on the last point, but which is a crucial enabler for everything. And that's the measures that would be necessary to scale up investment in emerging and developing economies, because I think that, more than anything else, is going to be crucial in determining the way we go from here.
Great, thank you. And looking forward, now that COP28 is over, what happens next?
Well, the agenda after a COP meeting is always then about implementation. So what can be done to put into practice some of the things that have been talked about now? You know, there's a formal answer to that, and that's the lead up to COP29, you know, as we move towards a new round of nationally determined contributions. Climate finance is going to be a big issue as we get towards Baku. But I think there's also a very much a real world agenda about putting in place the policies that really lead to that scaling up in the deployment of clean technologies. And again, we're focused very much on, you know, what is going to happen outside the advanced economies in China. Because if we look at our data on capital flows to the energy sector, there's been a very encouraging increase in clean energy investment by about 40% in the last 3 years. But pretty much all of that increase has come from advanced economies in China. So you don't yet see the benefits of participation in the clean energy economy really being spread throughout the world.
Great, thank you. And leading on from that, could you tell us who the key countries are across the world that will be responsible for driving this change? And within that, which industries are going to be the most critical?
I mean, if you look at the patterns of clean energy investment at the moment, one of the very striking things is the predominance of China in there. So this year, more than half of the wind and solar that are going to be deployed around the world are going to be deployed in China. More than half of the electric vehicles that are sold worldwide are sold in China. So, you know, we're used to the idea that China drives all sorts of trends in the energy sector, but we also need to recognize that China is a clean energy powerhouse as well. You know, the other advanced economies need to also be leading by example. And, you know, when we look at the United States, you're starting to see some serious commitments of capital coming as a result of new policies there. Notably the Inflation Reduction Act. Europe, too, is increasing the structural changes in its energy sector. Japan has the GX Energy Transformation Program, which is also driving some important changes there. But again, I would come back to the need to get faster progress in a bunch of other countries around the world as well. There are big opportunities there, and there are some bright spots, solar in India, wind in Brazil, but we need to see more movement in that part of the picture as well.
So despite there still being much work to do, there is clearly an international focus on change. Do you have any examples you could share with us of positive changes that are already happening?
I think you can see that in a number of areas. 10 years ago, 70% of the world's electricity was generated from fossil fuels. Now that's already much closer to 60%. And the momentum behind renewable deployment or low emission power deployment around the world, suggests to us that even with today's policy settings, that share is going to go well below 50% by the end of this decade. So with the electricity sector, that's a very dynamic picture. But also it's about the ways that we use that increasingly clean electricity. Electromobility is another good example. In 2020, roughly 1 in every 25 cars sold worldwide was electric. This year, that share is more like 1 in 5. And by the end of this decade, we think that even under today's policy setting, so I emphasize again, those could change, those could become more encouraging. But even with what we see today, 1 in every 2, or close to 1 in every 2 cars sold worldwide is likely to be electric by the end of the decade. So there's a number of examples there of quite significant shifts in mature, clean technologies. But I think the other important thing that we're seeing now is that some of the kind of elements that were perhaps moving less slowly now are starting to pick up speed. So we are seeing more dynamism in CCUS, for example. There are some big projects coming through, likewise, low emissions fuels. But, in order for us to have transitions that work, we can't just rely on a handful of technologies. We need to see progress across a pretty broad range of technologies and infrastructure. And, I can highlight some things that are moving quickly, but we need to be very watchful also of the things that are lagging behind a bit. And one element that we've highlighted a lot in our own analysis is that sometimes the grid infrastructure isn't moving as fast as it needs to. So there's a whole host of new renewable projects now, 1,500 gigawatts of renewable projects worldwide at advanced stages of development are stalled because they're waiting for a transmission link. So, we need to see that progress across the board.
That's great, thank you. And it's really good to hear of some positive changes that are already happening. Transitioning to cleaner energy can be challenging for a variety of reasons, some of which you've just touched on, but new and emerging technologies do promise to help ease the process. Could you share your own insights on which technologies are already aiding the energy transition and which ones might be on the horizon?
I think there's some very promising ones that fall under the general rubric of sort of clean electrification. And so generation technologies, clearly wind and solar are doing well. That's 95% of new renewable capacity is coming from those 2 technologies alone. Now, that's a very positive story, in particular for solar. But again, we need to be watchful. That 95% is probably a touch too high. We need to balance that out with some dispatchable low emissions sources of generation as well. On the end use side, we've talked a little bit about electric mobility, but heat pump sales are also pretty robust in many parts of the world, and they're overtaking sales of gas boilers in important markets for heat. There are other emerging technologies that I think are important to watch out for. There's a lot of dynamism, of course, in that low emissions fuel space. Hydrogen is coming through. Perhaps there's a process now where after a burst of initial enthusiasm, there's a more realistic now assessment about what it will take to set up some of these new value chains. But you're seeing very significant projects going ahead. Just a few months ago, the largest green hydrogen project so far, with a value of well over $8 billion, was approved in Saudi Arabia. And I think that's encouraging for a number of reasons, because it starts to show how even countries with very large fossil fuel resources are also looking at opportunities to diversify.
Great, thank you. And we've talked about the difficulties in limiting the impacts of climate change. What tactics do you think we might see in the future to manage the damage that's being caused by overshooting the 1.5 degree target?
We need to do everything we can on the mitigation side. So that means the structural changes in the energy sector that will move us towards a cleaner and lower emissions future. But we also need to recognize that, there is a risk that we will not be on track for that trajectory that is compliant with the Paris Agreement. Because, from our own analysis, we can see that while we have in a scenario that reflects today's policy settings, a peak in each of the fossil fuels by the end of this decade, we don't yet see a very steep decline post-peak. And that's what we would need to see in order to get on track for a Paris compliant outcome and a 1.5 compliant outcome. So working on also increasing the resilience of the energy sector, increasing the ability of countries to manage the effects of a changing climate are extremely important. Now, much of that lies outside the realms of the energy sector, but there's also things that we can do to improve the resilience of today's energy infrastructure, because there are parts of the system that are very vulnerable to the impacts of extreme weather events or of rising average temperatures. We need to have in mind that a heat wave has multiple effects on the ability of the energy system to operate. It degrades the performance of transmission networks. At very high temperatures, your solar panels actually start producing less electricity. It compromises your ability to move things around by inland waterways, as we saw in Europe last year. And it also leads to very large spikes in electricity consumption by consumers that are looking to their cooling technologies. So a combination of those things does create risks for the energy sector. And we need to be thinking through how we make the system more resilient to those kind of shocks.
Thank you so much for your insights today, Tim. We're coming towards the end of our conversation now, but before we go, I was wondering if I could ask one more question. Could you tell us what the IEA's role will be in managing some of the challenges we've talked about, both in the short and the long term?
So certainly the way that we see things at the IEA, we want to be at the center of that global energy discussion about a rapid, secure, affordable transition. And that is partly down to data. So we provide the data that allows policymakers and other decision makers to take informed views on what needs to be done. It's partly an analytical task. So many of the analyses that we produce here, including our flagship publication, which is the World Energy Outlook, help to think through different energy futures and the levers that can move us from more dangerous scenarios towards safer scenarios. And then I think part of it is just to be at the center of that global conversation, to make sure that we are talking to senior decision makers in advanced economies, in China, across emerging and developing economies, to try and make this as much as possible a cooperative process. Because we are living in a world where the international politics is a bit fragmented. There are risks of cooperation breaking down in quite a number of areas. So, one of the important roles that the IEA can fulfill is to try and bring countries together and to remind ourselves that if we are going to win this battle against climate change in a time frame that avoids very severe impacts, we need to be working together.
Well, that's all the discussion we have time for today. Thank you, Tim, for sharing your insights on the challenges facing the energy industry and your thoughts on COP28. It's been a great opportunity to hear more about what we can expect in the future. And thanks everyone for listening, and from us in Thematic Intelligence, see you next time.